So I would like to welcome all back after the coffee break for our next keynote speech. And I'm really happy to introduce Meredith Morovati from the Dryad repository to give our next keynote speech. And Dryad is a digital repository curated, and it's for various types of data. So we will learn more about that. And also parallels to open access publishing and the evolvement of that. And prior to joining Dryad 2 years ago, Meredith worked in memberships for various societies, and she also is experienced in publishing as she worked for Blackwell and others before. So I'm looking forward to her speech, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. This is my first visit to this conference, and I've really enjoyed the sessions so far. So I really appreciate being here, and thank you for the organizers for inviting me. I am going to talk about some open access and open data commonalities and differences today, and I've made a point to try to be somewhat provocative, so I appreciate you staying with me. I'm especially intrigued and interested in the idea that we heard at the beginning of yesterday from Heather Joseph about open access as a social movement that was outlined earlier, and I'll be building a bit on what she started while focusing on the needs of data. So to start off, just to outline, the particular areas I'm going to talk about, considering similarities between open access and open data, I think it's important to note that these are my observations as someone who's been in this space of open data for 2 years, so relatively new. But I see this space itself as still very much evolving, and so I don't see this as a serious limitation. In fact, my deeper background within scholarly publishing and textbook work and work for academic journal publishers as far back as the mid-1990s have really given me a kind of a unique experience and perspective of someone whom herself transitioned from a traditional to a more innovative field in scholarly communications. And I feel that in that way I have a lot in common with some of you all here today. And my overall impression from that transition is that there's been a lot of gains in academic publishing, but that in some ways we haven't come very far or far enough. For instance, when I worked in publishing last, open access was not a business model at all. So clearly gains have been made in this space, and that's really exciting to see and really very gratifying to be a part of. But the growth of membership, in fact, in OASPA over a few years really illustrates more gains that has been made in this space. But I'd also like to spend some time today looking at how to address the arguments against making things open. While I realize that I'm in the company of a group that generally thinks that open access is a good thing and also have some various commitments to it, I'm also really cognizant of the fact that everyone is in a different spot when it comes down to the particular ways that they support openness, and how often I find that there's a real lack of focus on a better or more holistic openness involving all outputs of scientific research. Essentially, we may talk about being open and agree on a vague or a specific set of principles, but many still have yet to walk the walk, so to speak. So to give you a perspective of the nonprofit that I represent, I'll quickly give you a description of what Dryad does. We are a digital repository, and we link data to scholarly articles. And this is a screenshot of the homepage with a location where you can submit articles and an area where you can search or browse for data as well. We have over 14,000 data packages in our system, and each data package is made up on average 3 to 4 files. And these represent over 50,000 authors and over 500 journals. A few unique features of Dryad is that every data package is linked out to a scholarly article that has undergone some kind of peer review or a thesis or a book chapter. Another is that all data has been curated by a trained professional curator. Dryad focuses on curated quality data that's associated with publications rather than data that's still in various stages of collection or collaboration, analysis, or study. And we work to integrate our data submission system with various manuscript submission systems to enable easy data publication and metadata transfer. We've done this with all the major manuscript systems, such as Editorial Manager, Scholar One, BenchPress, eJournal Press, and even a variety of proprietary systems. In addition, Dryad is a nonprofit organization, and we are governed by a board of directors and organizational members. And these members are encouraged to join Dryad, to have a say in the future of the organization, and to vote on board appointments and bylaw changes. The key difference in my mind between nonprofits versus commercial is that we are beholden to stakeholders rather than stockholders. And our guide is more mission-focused than commercial in nature, for example. So we work to involve the larger community of scholarly communications with a special focus on open advocates that are looking to improve access to scientific outputs in order to increase reproducibility, reusability, and to further uphold the arguments in the scholarly work. So one thing that I find compelling from the open access model are the similar motivations and the deep connections between the movements of open access publishing and open data. The movement for open access journals grew from a real frustration some researchers experienced when they were able to find some information related to a study, but hit roadblocks when trying to gain the whole story. And out of this grew the recognition that there was a need for a new paradigm. Also, a new business model or practice emerged, which is open access journals. And of course, that's not the entire story. Open access also needed to gain traction to get wider adoption. And this was and continues to be a significant culture shift. And the result, as is from many culture shifts, is a kind of fracture between advocates and opponents. And when a culture shift begins to take root, as what I think has happened with open access and open data, there begins to have more advocates and fewer opponents. In addition, both open access and open data have the need for a new model to figure out how this will actually work. And so both movements are steeped in the desire to gain access to the entire science, the need and challenges surrounding a culture shift, and of course, the very practical piece of how do we get this to work, and how do we create a successful model out of it. Again, the motivation for open data is similar to that of open access, but it has some very serious distinctions. I will get into an origin story of Dryad in a bit, which will give you a specific example. However, the general motivation for open data is not because whenever a researcher went to examine data that support an article, they found themselves locked out. No, it's much more serious than that. Without open infrastructure for data, the scholarship, which an article or argument is based on, is simply not there. It disappears. So this is much scarier. The idea that actual information gleaned from a study is lost. Open data isn't a movement simply to free data from various paywalls or restrictions, though that certainly does come into it. Looking at this slide that was taken from a study in 2013, you can see that as research articles age, the likelihood of finding data falls dramatically every year. Without archiving in a repository and making data available, every year 17% of the knowledge will not be retrieved. The likelihood of finding an author's email falls by 7% every year. So if a researcher doesn't publicly publish data, if they link it to a lab or an area that's not a repository, then relying on the author for access is a stick your head in the sand kind of policy and is not at all effective. And this is at the core of the open data movement. And I'm so glad to be talking now to open access publishers. I'd like to suggest that if you care about open access and if you've not addressed open data yet, then perhaps you've accomplished only a little about what you need to do. Papers are open, and that's important. But if you're linking to closed resources or not showing data at all, then we're still essentially at square one. An open access journal that does not link to open data is not truly open and may not fully achieve your goals. Here are a few examples of data that do not have natural homes of their own, and they're the exact kind of examples that without the kind of infrastructure that Dryad provides could be lost. And we aren't really just talking about archiving here. All data that supports arguments in the paper needs to be accessible, and accessibility now is digital. Researchers don't dig through files by hand, so if data is not labeled and described properly, if it is not discoverable by machines and understandable by humans, it's still in danger of disappearing. For example, how many important files are now in supplemental material that are not tagged properly with metadata, do not have digital identifiers, and are basically invisible to anyone who wants to access them? Now, these examples on these slides are what Dryad calls featured data. They're regular tweets that we send to highlight the breadth of data that we see and to promote data publishing and reuse, and to contribute conversations online about what can and should be archived. The one on the left is from the Royal Society, and it's a study on urban sounds and related social media posts to map out possible relation between sounds and emotion. The one on the right is also a study that collects social network data, and this time it's around a disaster event, Hurricane Sandy. This is a PLOS study, and it looks specifically at disaster awareness and makes recommendations on possible improvements for recovery and for planning. Datasets such as these examples may be useful for government, for urban planning, and for public sectors as well as researchers. And with Dryad's infrastructure, these datasets are curated, they're linked to the article, and they're preserved for reuse. So to start with the complaints about open data, the biggest, and in my opinion, most annoying argument about working with open data is that it's too hard, and I feel like you've heard this before as open access advocates. Critics say it's too hard, it takes too much time to make things open, that working with data and figuring out what data to preserve and when we should do so is very difficult. There's too many barriers in front of researchers, and we can't discourage them from publishing in our journal. This argument's not a strong one for many reasons. And the first, in my mind, is that when things are difficult in a business or a process, by not addressing them, you are losing out on the chance to innovate or to solve a problem. And we know that solving problems and addressing areas of friction is how you show that your service or your source has value. In addition, Dryad has shown that this is not overly difficult to manage. We made a decision early on that we would focus on data that has a one-to-one association with the literature. And we've done this with our partners and have been so successful that we now have data from over 500 journals and nearly 14,000 different articles. So to address how to work with data, the first thing you need, and Dryad has a lot of experience with this, as so many colleagues here today, is a policy on how to handle data. And here are just a few examples of policy sites from the BMJ, the Royal Society, and the American Geophysical Union on different ways to approach data policy. As publishers, you are already experts at providing instructions to authors and working to clarify them and move them toward the desired behavior. Another example was shared yesterday when Amy Kennel gave a quick introduction to the Springer Nature suite of data policies that are starting to be applied across all Springer Nature journals. So to give in to the idea this is too hard with regards to data is really shirking a kind of responsibility. In fact, I'd like to see data policy become one of the things that OASPA takes on within its open access spectrum tool. OASPA should consider including an evaluation of data policy and linking to open resources as a part of evaluating where a publication is in terms of its spectrum of openness. For example, the How Open Is It spectrum includes ranking in the most open column for journals that provide data and supplemental data in formats that are available for discovery. That's essential, and I'm very glad to see that. But you don't suggest that the data be open or that the policy has a requirement as part of your journals, and I think this is an area where we could improve. The origin story of Dryad shows that policy is not only not too hard, but it's very possible and it can be very innovative. Dryad has a really unique story, and it begins with a joint data archiving policy. The policy stated that data should be deposited in an appropriate public archive as a condition of publication. It It should link back to the article, and that the data should be preserved with the goal of future reuse. The policy was designed and adopted by a dozen or so journal editors that came together and agreed on this. That was in 2011. Of course, a coffee shop was involved because science, but the really profound thing was the coming together of the original adapters of the policy. So a group of individuals who work for different and sometimes competing journals decided they could work together to become more open. This should sound familiar to you. They were driven by the very same passion that started open access and the membership of OASPA. These JDAP adopters recognized that they currently had half of the information that made up the arguments and science, and that to let this continue was not acceptable. This is a profound thing. The result was a clear and simple policy that was spread across a group of journals. It didn't penalize anyone specifically. It did not create unnecessary hurdles, but had a minimum amount of requirements and enabled open data linking quickly, easily, and automatically. So let's look at how effective this data policy was. So this study, and some of the lines you can see along the axes, was taken from a phylogenetic data to see how data availability was impacted by JDAP, and to compare it to the US National Science Foundation's policy that required data management plans, and they were both introduced around the same time. So that vertical axis shows the proportion of data that was available from articles published between the years 2002 and 2014, which is shown along the horizontal. So the first block illustrates that when papers are funded by the National Science Foundation, but are published in papers without JDAP, there was a minor increase in availability after 2011. Contrast this with the middle block. When papers were published in a journal that put JDAP into practice, even if they were not funded by NSF, the post-JDAP increase was very impressive. The availability of data increased from less than 10% to over 80% in a few short years. What made the difference here was good, clear policy and infrastructure to support it. In these cases, the infrastructure was mainly Dryad and other specialized repositories or community repositories, but for other communities, preferred infrastructure could be different. Another claim by OA opponents is that it lacks quality. You just pay and get published. If you pay and be published in an article, you're automatically suspect, right? Those who discourage open data suggest similar things. Oh, the data's no good, there's too much noise. If you have too much data and it's not useful, you can't find it, you can't use it. I believe that these red herring arguments are really just a distraction. If you never improve data and don't make it findable, sure, it's not that useful. Metadata has quality needs, and you need to pay attention to that. Same with open access publishing. New traditional journals also are suspect for quality when they start. There's nothing inherent in openness or in fees that make something lack quality. In fact, quality is one of your main goals as publishers. Peer review, with all its challenges, is set up to perform a review of material to assess quality. Does peer review have issues? Sure. Can it be improved? Of course. And are publishers and stakeholders concerned with working on improvements and models of review? Are they trying to improve the process? Absolutely, they are. Well, Dryad does this too. We do quality. We have answered these issues already with data, and we continue to innovate on improvements in this area. At the very start, Dryad recognized this tension between quality and efficiency. And as OA publishers, you're often working on days to publication as a possible metrics for improvement or for evaluation. And we do the same. We intentionally developed a light touch curation to ensure basic checks and quality metadata that does not put too many burdens in front of the researcher or drag down the process. But we also make sure data is academic, linked to the literature, files are virus-free, they can be viewed, there are no intellectual property issues, and we have seen some. And more, we're looking to evaluate that there are no identifiable human subject data, for instance. We know that scientists no longer go to the library to find research and dig through stacks of physical records. Technology has changed that. So if data is really going to be open and accessible, then it must be discovered by machines and understandable to humans. If you can search for data and you can't understand it, it's not that useful. If you have a lovely curated data set that never gets aggregated into searching tools, then again, not that useful. Quality metadata is the answer to this, and Dryad manages this with this curation. Our curators also have an essential and helpful role in the infrastructure that provides quick customer service with regards to the variety of data questions we get. So quality is provided, barriers are removed, and we take care of the hard work of data to ensure visibility and discoverable and encourage and guide quality documentation for reuse. And as you can see, though they're not overly legible, from a small sample of tweets, our curators definitely have their own fan base. You can answer your critics and you can accomplish your goals with quality data and with generally making things more open, not less. After implementing the data policy of JDAP, Executive Director of the British Ecological Society, Hazel Norman, answered her critics to say that the data requirement was not seen as a horrible burden, but they put time and effort into explaining the goal to their community, and journal submissions grew. Not only that, but the move was seen as an increase in quality, and it enhanced their reputation as a progressive publisher. So what if you're already there and want to increase your quality? Well, data policies include looking at data to make sure it's quality. Since quality is the best answer to our critics, everyone should be looking at data during the time of review. Just start to review and look to see if the data's there or ask questions about it. If you care if your article is based upon science, then saying it's too hard to just look is essentially avoiding improvement. In fact, researchers do have some assumptions around this. This slide was taken from a 2015 study that considered the expectations of researchers surrounding published data, which is the bars at the top, says how would you expect a published data set to differ from a shared one, and a peer-reviewed data, and that is the second block. What would you expect data peer review to consider? The authors found that researchers expect that a published data set will be, and the top three are openly available, deposited in a repository, and be the basis of a research paper. I know to those in the room who are not working with data yet, this sounds hard, but it's also exactly what Dryad and other repositories do, and do so successfully. And what do they expect data peer review to consider? Well, the top two are methods and metadata. Dryad takes care of the metadata with our curation and making sure you have a researcher that deposits data and provides methods explanations is really a big part of the battle. This does not say that you need to recreate the study. Start with methods and metadata. Again, there's a variety of publishers doing some of this, but we will not improve this practice unless we are all committed to the science that is underlying your article, and if you don't take advantage of groups like Dryad and others that are doing this every day. For quality open access, if you're going to be committed to openness and quality, many still need to work harder on enforcing data policies. This figure comes from a 2011 study of 12 journals where the author wanted to discover what fraction of articles have data available and how the specifics in the journal policy impact that. Note that each numbered bar from 1 to 12 represents a different journal, so instead of journal names, there's numbers. What I find is though Dryad has a great example of data policy that was adopted across a spectrum of editors, and we've seen some earlier, and some of your colleagues have some as well, that still many publishers fall short in terms of policy. This figure shows that policy is essential in having either real data support or basically lip service to openness and to quality. My first observation is illustrated in the grouping from 1 through 4 and 5 through 8. Here you can see the first group, 1 through 4, is a group with no archiving policy, and the second group, 5 through 8, recommends archiving. Note that there's very little different in outcomes. Also interesting to see, groups 9 and 10 and 11 and 12 on the right, these journals all mandate archiving. But the journals that include a data availability statement, which is shown in 11 and 12, have a much better uptake than those who are mandating archiving and do not include this statement, which is shown in 9 and 10. The takeaway is that policy works best with workflow methods to support it, and that recommending archiving is equal to no archiving policy at all. One of the main issues I come up with again and again is the excuse that data is too expensive, but this is simply not true. If you continue to not try to make this available to your authors, not support infrastructure that already is in place, then I expect that in the future, the expense will be on the other side. Again, Dryad has figured out how to address this, and we've learned a lot from this group and worked from your model. Dryad is unusual in that it charges a data publication charge, which we call a DPC, which is based upon the idea of an article processing charge. We encourage journals and publishers and funders to cover these on behalf of their researchers, and many do, so that when researchers come to deposit data in Dryad and it's been sponsored, there's no fee. But if a plan is not in place, they can pay themselves. And of course, there are waivers for certain countries, low-income countries. An important distinction here is that the DPC is actually charged only when data is published. And if an article is not accepted, it is not charged. And that there is no charge to download or access data. So Dryad has now had 3 years of experience charging DPCs, and we have learned a lot. The advantage of the DPC is that it allows for fast growth, it scales with more use, it's flexible, it's very transparent, and we encourage this as a service linked to publication and to curation, but it's not linked to accessing data, which is completely open from our site. As I said, things like waivers for developing countries and payment plans for higher and lower volume partners, and we try to keep the costs low. If there's no plan in place, the average cost is a little less than $120 US. But I'll freely admit, we have not figured out all of it. We're still learning. We are still continuing to need to grow. And some months are certainly better than others. But we've figured out a viable and successful way to make fees transparent, affordable, and scalable with the goal of being sustainable on our own and using funding for new projects or new innovation. So some funders are paying for APCs. Well, we're innovating in this space as well, currently testing out a hybrid of data publication fees with funder support. We're constantly testing out ways to become more sustainable, to enable a variety of stakeholders to support DPCs so that we can take the burden off of the individual researcher. But we still need to rely on help from partners and some growth in funding. This new pilot from the U.S. National Science Foundation is specifically allowing us to enable researchers who are working with data to publish it and charge it to their grant. This is for a limited time, and we're testing out the process, and will give us information on use, on preferences of our submitters, of our publishing partners, and to try out this new workflow that provides another way of supporting the cost to publish data. Saying something is too hard or too expensive doesn't really relieve us of the responsibility to address it, to make it better, and to try something new. We are innovating in this space, and we're experimenting in different ways to make data more affordable and to integrate it with APCs and with publishing, and we would encourage you to innovate with us. For instance, what would it look like if we combined the APC and the DPC to remove some of the friction from the process? This is not overly difficult, and some of our partners are actually already doing this. So data policies will help you answer your critics' suggestion that you lack quality, and Dryad is one group that has figured out how to answer the complaint that it's too hard or could be too expensive. But the main point also is that being open in this space is not risky. A vast majority of researchers from the study here show that they are willing to share data and to do so across disciplines, and that as a benefit of doing so, which we heard earlier, they expect to be cited. And so there are certainly a few areas of holdouts these are really in the minority, and opening your data could really just be pushing at an open door. In the early years of executive director of Dryad, I've had the fortune of meeting and talking to so many stakeholders in scholarly communications, including journal editors, managing editors, business development, publishing, funders, librarians, data repository managers, the list just goes on. I just returned from International Data Week, where many of these stakeholders came together to talk about interoperability improvements, variety of business models, infrastructure issues, and the issues surrounding data specifically and publications. We move in a field where working and focusing on data and making sure that the pieces of scholarly communications are linked together. And I admit that some are farther down the road toward increased openness and working with data, but no one has it completely figured out. Have we accomplished openness? Is the open literature achieving its mission? Were the problems surrounding closed literature solved? I suggest not yet. Ultimately, what I have learned that the various stakeholders in open access and in open data have many motivations and mission in common. We agree on the importance of open. However, if you share our goal of open science and support the notion that we can come together and improve our practice, that is, if you really care about data, then we can figure this out together. If you can complete the sentence Heather Joseph mentioned earlier yesterday, open in order to, and you think we have these missions in common, which I believe we do, then you may think harder and act accordingly to enable open data as a strategy to achieve your goals. Open access publishers are already experts at culture change. You are adept at incentives and policies and encourage the desired behavior of your users. You've created a culture and a new paradigm that is growing and continuing to improve. And you know that open data advocates and repositories work hard to address making data sharing easy and open, addressing quality and making it affordable. But your mission and values would be more consistent if you worked with open data and removed the walls between your open literature and other outputs. You must engage policy as an author tool. Open data as a service deserves your attention. We can work together and learn from our business models, our need to encourage adaptation, and admit that getting bogged down in the details of the technology should not hold us back. We can work together more efficiently to bring about the change that the original advocates of open access publishing really desired. Thank you very much.
So, given the time, I think we have time for one or two, maybe three questions before lunch. So, yeah, who has a question for Meredith?
Thanks, Meredith. That was great. You suggested quite early on in your talk that OASPA might require its members, as one step, to have an open data policy. You finished by saying we can work together on how open is it around both access to papers and access to data. What other steps can you see between a full-on requirement by OASPA for its members to require data sharing and the current state of play where communities and publishers are coming at this at different rates? How do we start to coalesce all of that?
That's a good question. I think in my recent experience at International Data Week highlighted this as well, where I had the opportunity to meet with a variety of publishers that was spearheaded by Springer Nature to come together in this research data environment to actually talk about policy specific with journals. That's one example I saw recently, and there's different publishers working in this space. I guess what I'd like to see is considering linking out to open resources as part of the idea of being an open access publisher a little more thoughtfully. I'd like to see the idea of what your policy is like, where you're evaluating different kinds of policy. It's my opinion that linking out or having no data policy is certainly not a good policy. Open data isn't necessarily the perfect example for all kinds of data. Data has different needs in different communities, but requiring some kind of data, requiring data to be available, and ultimately working to make it open, in my view, is the right way to accomplish these goals. And to use data as a strategy to achieve this for OASPA, I think could be quite valuable for the community.
Hi, Don Samuelek, President, U.S. Operations of Editage, but I'm also spearheading a coalition for responsible publication resources. So my question is more on that side. I travel a lot through Asia, and one of the problems obviously is plagiarism and other things, but one of the increasing concerns is going to be data theft when you have open data, because there are writing mills that will just simply be stealing data from open data sets, writing papers, publishing them, and we will not know that the data was stolen. So we can identify plagiarism by Authenticate because of combined data sets that publishers have put together of papers that we can map. So my question is, what are we doing with respect to fingerprinting data so publishers will be able to identify stolen data that is being submitted as original works of research?
Well, I think that question is a good one for a couple of different levels. I like that you got at the idea that different cultures have different expectations and different needs surrounding open. A recent Dryad community meeting had a variety of speakers. It was a webinar that we had available. And one of our speakers was a Dryad board member who is the editor-in-chief of Biotropico, which is this, I think it's the Association of Tropical Biology and Conservation, if I didn't get that mixed up. And in his experience, he had a really good experience of creating an open data policy for his community in an area that was over 50% Latin American and different areas that were not overly comfortable with the idea of open data. And there's a couple of different reasons for this. One is because they move in an area where they don't have control over very much of their social environment, their political environment. And so scooping was certainly an issue, but it was a deeper actual issue than that. At RDA, I also had the opportunity to talk to someone who represented a group in a variety of countries in the continent of Africa, who is also working in this space. And so the way this open data policy that happened for this particular journal, Biotropica, and something I recommended to this colleague who's based in I think she was based in actually South Africa, is that if you get your, and I'm sure you all have experience with this, if you get your opponents together and working together to create the policy, you often can address some of these fears of openness and these fears of scooping. So that was something that was very successful in the particular case example that we had in Biotropica Journal. Now, in order to map out effectively and make sure publishers know where data is and to look about plagiarism, I feel like the answer would be the same with any scholarly output. Plagiarism is an issue in all kinds of outputs, and this is one of the reasons why data publication is important, as it creates a digital object identifier that you will be able to cite and you'll be able to track and you'll be able to tell the outputs and the references that are available there as well.
Okay, just
one
a
last
quick question. So I'm just wondering on your thoughts on the fact that Jennifer Griffiths with the Royal Society of Chemistry, as data ages, data standards will change. That is that, data that is 15 to 20 years old may not even be accessible with the instruments that are available at that point. We find that a lot in chemistry because software evolves. Different companies have different standards. And so do you feel like that's your responsibility? To keep that current, or it's a big problem?
Well, I mean, are you specifically meaning migration of types? Because Dryad does work on that.
Well, raw data, for example, if you are a researcher in 20 years and download a raw data set from a mass spectrometer, for example, in chemistry, you may simply not have the software to be able to pull that data up and read it. It becomes, it might as well have disappeared. So
Yeah, that's a good question. So we see a lot of that at Dryad, and this is one of the benefits, of curation of data. And again, Dryad's data curation is fairly light level. I think Sonia gave us an example of a more detailed level, and there's a variety of curation levels out there, including some that actually do replicate studies. One of the things that Dryad does look at, and I think would be included in a light level curation, is this proprietary software piece. And this is one of the reasons why our curators open everything and look at it. We encourage researchers to use different formats that'll migrate properly, and with some formats, we have plans to migrate them in the future. So this is something that the repository that a community should work on, you should ask that of the repository if you're working with the community, if they have plans on some of those migration efforts. And I think that, we don't have it all solved, but we could say at this point that we have the ability to migrate a vast majority of the files that we see. We won't be able to right now everything, but in the future we'll improve that. And I think that we'll also be working with, and I'd always encourage repositories to work with the journals or the publishers to ask them their specific, assistance in, requiring certain files or discouraging, certain files as well for readability as well as migration issues.
Okay, so please join me to thank Meredith again for her talk and all of you for the discussion.